Dr. Bruce Chalmer, welcome to the Untrivial Podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, and thanks for having me on. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. I'm enjoying this.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for being here. So, you are a couples therapist, but I love if you could take the time to just tell folks who aren't familiar with you a little bit about your background and yourself.
Yeah. Well, I've been a couples therapist now in private practice for over 30 years, coming up on 31 actually this month, as a matter of fact. Before that, I don't know if people can see this or just hear, probably most folks, at least on our podcast, most folks are hearing it, not seeing it.
Mm.
And so they may not realize, but I am not a young person. I am in my 70s. And so if you do the math on 30 years, I was already in my early 40s when I got licensed. And so before that, I had some other careers I was doing. I started off right out of college, or fairly soon out of college. I ended up getting a master's degree in statistics, and I was a statistician for a while. I was teaching courses in data communications for a while. Um, and I enjoyed that work, but it wasn't until I got into getting trained as a therapist, and particular couples work really started to get to me fairly early, that I really felt like it was a calling. It just felt like, wow, this is something I so want to be able to do. It's such a privilege to be admitted into people's lives that way. I've been doing that ever since, and uh, I'm continuing to do it into my 70s because I love doing it. That's why I keep doing it. Now, how did I end up doing the clinical work? Well, this is a story I think that is true of a lot of folks who got into this line of work. I went through a crisis of my own. My first marriage, which implies I'm in a second marriage, which I am. I'll talk about that too. Um, we were having really a lot of very painful difficulty. We were in a lot of ways very well suited to each other, but just there were some things that just were not working. And it was very, very painful. And that's what got me into therapy, both individual and also couples therapy. And through that experience, it was so powerful to feel so bad and have this experience that said, oh, okay, I still felt bad, but I could, but I could see some hope.
Yeah.
And, I over the course of a number of years, I experienced some different people doing individual therapy, some good and some, frankly, not so good, and several people doing couples therapy, some good and some not so good. But I learned a lot from all of it. And I just ended up being so taken by it. I just wanted to continue to do it. That marriage actually ended sometime after we had done some therapy that seemed to be saving it. But the very short story that I like to tell about my first marriage was that both my ex and I have gone on to marry really wonderful women, and we're both a lot happier.
There
So
you go.
the fact that we've both married women is sort of an indication of why our marriage wasn't working out so hot.
Yeah.
But once we each found someone who was sexually oriented in the complementary direction, it works a lot better. So we all get
There
along
you
great now.
go.
So
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's also really great to hear even, that many years ago in your first marriage that you were open to therapy because I still feel like there is a bit of a stigma and I'm imagining there was maybe a little bit more of a stigma back in those days. Like, could you provide any insight on what that was like and if there was an element of like secrecy or like taboo in terms of going to therapy
yeah.
for your marriage?
Yeah, not so much then. By the time we were doing therapy, we were into the 90s, I guess. Yeah, pretty much in the early 1990s. There didn't seem to be a lot of stigma about that. Um, what there was, and in terms of stigma, is what wasn't so much the issue. What there was guys, and I speak as one, as a group, still tend to be very resistant to the idea of therapy. Now, obviously,
Mhm.
there's lots of exceptions to that. I've worked with plenty of male clients in my career as well. But as a couples therapist, it's an overwhelming majority. I don't know what the percentage would be, but it's an overwhelming majority of the folks, the couples, the heterosexual couples that come to see me, that the woman either was the one who set it up, which is most of the time, or if it was the man setting it up, he was doing it because the woman had basically said, you either do this or we're done. And
Mm.
so I actually have in one of my books, in one of my recent books, actually, I have a chapter which I got from a video I made several years ago called How to Get Your Reluctant Guy to Try Couples Therapy with You. And it's quite gendered, aimed specifically at women trying to convince men. And I don't have any authority to speak as a woman, do I? But I have some authority to speak as a man who knows what it feels like to be resistant And it's an interesting phenomenon. Very so
Yeah.
not so much taboo anymore. There was a when I was first getting trained, and I did a lot of individual. I worked as an individual therapist as well as a couples therapist earlier in my career for quite a number of years. And when I was getting trained, I know one of my mentors was a lovely man that I knew actually through my synagogue, as a matter of fact. But he was a psychologist, and he was probably 25 years older than me, something like that. And in his office, he had it set up so that there's a door you come in from the waiting room and another door you leave his office from so that, God forbid, anybody should actually see that someone
Whoa.
else is in therapy. And that I don't think that is the norm anymore. It certainly wasn't when I started in practice, though.
Yeah.
Nobody had any problem with the notion of a waiting room where someone might see you're there to see someone. So I think the stigma has largely passed. I don't know. And you are clearly, I don't know how old you are, but you're clearly younger than me. That's true of most of the folks I talk to nowadays. But I don't know if in your generation you find that there is less of that there's still any sort of stigma, or what's your
I
experience?
think there's definitely a lot less. Like, I'm 33, and I think a lot of people are very open about talking about marriage, and almost like I think there used to be this shame that, if you were having problems, there was something wrong. Whereas now I think it's widely accepted that like every couple fights, like every couple is going to go through challenges or have kids, and their marriage and their relationship is going to evolve and change. And so I think there's just a lot more information and understanding of the realities of those things. And so when you might want to explore therapy, it's kind of just accepted that like, oh, there's nothing wrong with us necessarily.
Mhm.
We're trying to face and solve the problems that are naturally occurring within a long-term relationship. And so I think there's a lot more openness to that. And I also think the whole idea of self-development culture and like optimization culture has kind of like seeped its way into marriages as well. It's like, how do we, make our marriage the best it can be? And if
Mhm.
it's utilizing a coach or a therapist as part of that to make us, as effective and loving and caring and as great as parents as we could be, then like why not do that? And so I kind of look at couples therapy that way too. It's like, how do we make ourselves the best in our relationship that we could be and go from there. And so, yeah, I think it's more popular, it's more common, it's more discussed at our age, but I wouldn't say it's completely gone because I definitely have still spoken to friends and yeah, definitely more on the male side. There's still a little bit of resistance depending on who you are and kind of the notions of therapy you grew up with and the culture
Yeah.
you grew up in, but I'd say it's a lot better.
Mhm. Well, yeah, and I've noted that, of course, with so many folks in your age cohort that I do work with, and I've
Mhm.
seen that yeah, it doesn't seem like people are saying, "Oh my god, it's a horrible thing that we're in therapy." That the resistance for men, though, is one of the things I point out actually when I write about that, and this is my sort of my message to women trying to get a guy in their life, to try it with them. The guy's resistance isn't crazy, nor is her wanting to do it crazy. Neither one of those things are
Mm.
crazy. But often the woman is feeling things like, "He doesn't care enough about me to try this," or "He's just stubborn," or, he's being an arrogant guy," which, yeah, let's face it, we often are, but nevertheless. And she's missing the main reason, but mostly because he won't say it even to himself, never mind to her. The main reason that we resist as guys is we're terrified. We don't wanna say
Mm.
we're terrified even to ourselves, certainly not to our female partners, but we are terrified, and what I point out is we are terrified for good reason, because lots of couples, if you look around, everybody I mean, you probably know folks by now who have been together and have split up. Lots of couples go to couples therapy and end up splitting up. And
Right.
again, I'm not saying anything good or bad about couples therapy, I mean, that is the reality, that is often the case, and moreover, there is often a feeling among guys that if you go to a couples therapist, he or she is gonna and even if it's a male therapist, is gonna be somewhat biased against guys,
Mm.
also for good reason, because we often are. And I don't mean to say that as if to say that's good or bad. Well, I think it's sort of bad, but it's not that it's not that women are in charge of it. We're also biased against women sometimes too, but that phenomenon that says in a couples therapy milieu, even if it's a male therapist, it's much more a feminine domain. Women wanna
Mm.
talk about this shit, and men don't. Again,
Right.
stereotyping there. Women wanna talk, and again, here I am in the field, I love talking about it, but I'm also, a heterosexual guy, I have my worries about things like that. Women often, not always, but often can talk rings around men when it comes around to emotional topics. So men feel somewhat incompetent. And their worry often is that the therapist is either going to imply or sometimes say directly, "Hey, woman I'm working with, you're together with a jerk. You should get rid of him."
Mm.
And sometimes that actually happens. I've heard folks, and it's often the woman who's appalled by that as much as the man. I've had folks come to me after they've been with some other therapists, and they will tell stories like that. So the woman will be the one who's saying, she or he just kept taking my side and it wasn't doing us any good at all. That's not what
Mm.
I want. I want to be challenged too. I want us to figure out how we can actually hear each other. I don't want him to be put down and I don't want to win. I want us to win.
Yeah, it's not about picking sides or teams. It's like, how do you as a couple move through the problem,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's true. Even if they end up deciding to split up, they in general, it's not about, winning or losing with respect to even that. It's about healing in general. What do I
Mhm.
consider a success? And of course, in couples therapy, there are at least three opinions to be had about that. Mine, I think, being the least important of them. It's the couple themselves that needs to figure out whether it's a success or not. And they
Mhm.
often don't agree about that at all. If one of them comes in kind of leaning out and feeling like, "Oh, this is kind of a last ditch thing, and I'm pretty sure we need to split up." And that's what emerges from the therapy. They're feeling like, "Oh, good, that clarified everything." And the other person's feeling like, "This is a total bust. I wanted to save a relationship." And I don't even attempt to overlay my opinion on that. I mean, I'll have an opinion about whether it seems to be helping or not, but I'll always check it with a couple. I've had couples I've worked with where they're telling me it's helping and I can't see it. So I will ask them, I hear you're saying this is helping. Tell me how, because it's not evident to me. You're still talking about really nasty conflict. You're still talking about ways that you don't feel like a lot has changed.
Mm.
Sometimes what they'll say is, well, this is the only place we can actually come and talk about this. So at least that's good. And I appreciate that, but I don't want to just keep, having people come in and keep them miserable.
Mhm. Yeah, change might be slow depending on how entrenched in your patterns and fights and cycles you are. But I
Yeah.
guess on that note, in terms of couples who might be, pretty deep into their relationship and, past kids or been together for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, whatever it is. You wrote a book called The Passion Paradox, When You Feel Miles Apart and Still Love Each Other. And
Hmm.
so I'd love to talk about first almost that transition and way that people move miles apart from,
Mm.
initially a really lovely and great start to a marriage with a wedding and all of that. How do you get there? And then let's talk about that paradox and what we do.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's my most recent book as of the time we're recording this. And I've actually, since I wrote that book, turned it into a video course as well, a self-paced video course, which I highly recommend, of course, as if I didn't recommend my books, but I especially recommend the video course. Yeah, that phenomenon, and the reason I wrote that book with that subtitle is that is so many of the couples that I work with. They've been together for however long, often very long, sometimes, 30, 40, 50 years on occasion, often not that long, but, a number of years. And they've experienced that loss of that initial passion that they had. And I say passion, I don't just mean sexual, although it's often sexual, but that sense of the fact that they felt this erotic charge between them, again, not just in the sexual domain specifically, but just more generally. Where did that go? Well, the paradox I refer to, and this is my favorite way of explaining it. I'm sure there are lots of ways of explaining this, but my favorite way of understanding it is for a relationship to work well, we need to have two different sets of needs adequately fulfilled. And I'm using that word needs advisedly because you could say I need something when really what you mean is you desire something. I mean needs. And the reason I talk about two different sets of needs is that they are somewhat in conflict with each other, even though they're both really important. They're both needs. That's the paradox. So what do I call these two sets of needs? I call them stability and intimacy. And so what happens to a couple when they first get together? Well, first of all, when you first meet somebody, kind of by literally, you don't know anything about them. You lots of preconceived ideas about them. It's all illusion, and I don't mean that in a cynical way. Do you know what I mean? But all you've got is your own projections and illusions and whatever other terms you want to use for it. It's like, well, I have this idea of this person, and oh my God, I met this person, and he or she is just tickling my fancy there's an
Yeah.
old fashioned term, isn't it? There's just like something about them is feeling like, ooh, I want to be with this person. You're starting to feel that sense of connection and bonding and attraction. And then you start to get to know them, a normal process. And getting to know somebody is, again, in a very literal sense, disillusionment. You are replacing your illusions with actual experience, utterly normal process. And that can be beautiful. That can go very well. And look, it is clearly, folks, I know folks, it is clearly the case that some couples right from the get-go do seem to be well suited in lots of different ways. Their values more or less line up and their living habits more or less line up and all that kind of stuff. And then there's other couples where they don't so well, so they're experiencing various kinds of friction. But whatever's going on there, often what then happens is they proceed to define their relationship more explicitly, that you become boyfriend and girlfriend and you become fiancés and then perhaps you get married and somewhere in there before or after you get married, in your generation, it's more often before than after. My generation, it was always after. You might have kids.
Mm,
In my generation is you would meet somebody, you might end up, getting engaged and married and then you move in together and then you have kids and, it is often, I sound like an old fogey, but I qualify. So there we go. So that phenomenon of stabilizing, of putting your relationship together in a structure is all about stability. And stability is really important. What do I mean by stability? I simply mean that it doesn't feel shaky. That's what the word stable means. And shaky in the sense of anxiety producing. If you
mm,
wake up in the morning and you're not worried about your relationship, it feels stable. It's like, well, it's one thing I don't have to worry about. It's like maybe other stuff is causing me anxiety, but not that.
right.
Conversely, if you wake up in the morning and you're feeling like, oh no, are we going to make it through another day? Or, how much pain are we going to cause here? That doesn't feel stable at all. So it's about the level of anxiety. So what the skills of stability are all about is keeping that anxiety level low. So what's going to keep the anxiety level relatively low? What's going to avoid anxiety? I like to refer, I think I said this in that book tonight. And thank you for reading my book, by the way. I really appreciate that when an interviewer's actually read the book. That's really kind
Of
of nice.
course.
I talk about in the book the skills of stability. I think I call them the boring trifecta.
Mhm.
They are reliability, responsibility, and accountability. Those three all are really important. I'm not knocking any of them. They're really important. They're boring in the sense that they're all about predictability. And if you read a novel and all the characters have those wonderful traits, you have no novel. It is utterly boring. It's nothing, you know. But real life, nobody's perfect at those, the boring trifecta. So that's all about stability. Those skills are really important. And indeed, when I meet people in a first session, I almost always have this little mini lecture about stability and intimacy to a couple in the first session. And often it's sort of a light bulb moment. They're saying, oh, I really never thought of it that way. I will point out when I'm talking about stability, saying, well, look, now that we're old buddies, because I've known you for 20 minutes, I can already tell something about the two of you, pretty sure, that really relates to stability. Neither one of you is batshit crazy. Pretty sure. And they smile. And they'll often say, well, you haven't seen me yet. And I don't mean to be making fun of serious mental health issues, which of course do exist, but I mean the vast, vast majority of the folks I work with in outpatient couples therapy aren't schizophrenic, having some
Yeah,
sort of psychotic break. They're not in the middle of a manic episode,
right.
not stuff like that. So that simply means, and they're generally, intelligent. They're usually not cognitively impaired to be sitting there with a couples therapist, usually not. So
Mhm.
all of those things mean they're pretty good at stability. And, to be able to, contact a couples therapist and kind of work the system that way, that's usually a pretty good sign that they're good at stability. So those are all really important. And then, not only getting together, getting married, perhaps upping the ante by having children, which hugely ups the ante on stability.
Yeah.
And I didn't ask, Ellie, do you have kids?
I do. I have an 18-month-old
An 18-month.
and a
Oh,
son.
wow. So I don't
Mhm.
know, you might relate to that notion of stability being really important. You want to give your
Yeah.
son
The
the
structure that has
yeah,
now come to our life, it's very, very structured.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So, again, taking nothing away from stability. However, I'm saying all these, the chief skills of stability are all about keeping the anxiety level low. Well, let's talk about the other big need, which is intimacy. What do I mean by intimacy? Here, I better sort of define my terms. I don't just mean sex, although sex is often part of it for couples. But by intimacy, I mean more generally that feeling where you can be who you are in the relationship with the other person doing the same. So it's when you can be present and honest with yourself and each other. Those are those
Mhm.
moments of intimacy. I say moments because nobody can be intimate 24/7 because, I'm not in touch with myself all the time. It's like you go down a social media rabbit hole or something like that. It's like, where have I been for the last half hour?
Yeah.
So but in general, couples need enough of that to feel alive. That's what helps you feel alive. The chief skill of intimacy is not at all keeping the anxiety level low. Quite the contrary. The chief skill of intimacy is to tolerate anxiety without crossing over into panic. And
Mm.
people will sometimes look at me and say, well, wait a minute. I thought doesn't intimacy feel good? Well, sure. When it does, of course it does. If what you're imagining is, great sex or lovely moments together, enjoying a beautiful sunset or enjoying an experience together or a meal or whatever it might be. Sure. Those are lovely. They feel great. They can
Mhm.
feel ecstatic, but intimacy also involves something as simple as a garden variety complaint. Hey, I wish you would wipe down the sink after you finish brushing your teeth. This is an example from my own life, by the way. I had to learn that one. And my wife was so nice about it. See, it's why we get along so well. She's really nice about me being annoying, which is another, by the way, another point about I'll come back around to that. I'll just bookmark it for right now. But God knows the one constant is that we are all annoyed and we are all annoying. And
Yes.
one of the chief skills of intimacy, it's sort of a corollary to what I was saying, is the ability to be moderately annoyed. And I always like to point out my wife needs that skill way more than I do because I'm way more annoying. So she has really had lots of practice with that skill, much more than I have. She's hardly annoying to me at all. But I'm annoying to her, and she's very nice about it, and that's why we get along well. And it's not that I'm not trying to let myself off the hook and say, "Oh, well, I'm not going to try." I do try. I actually do wipe down the sink now after I've been doing that now for years. But
Yeah.
all of this has to do with intimacy. It's that so, complaints, you're gonna raise anxiety, and I used a trivial example, but sometimes it's not so trivial. You know, "I need to tell you, I wish you wouldn't be drinking so much when we're at a party," or, "I need to tell you that I'm really worried that I think, your inability to hold down a job is really threatening our financial stability here," Those
Mhm.
sorts of things, those serious things require if you're gonna, bring it up at all, it's gonna raise anxiety. So, what stable couples tend to do is they will often put a premium on stability. Now, what does that mean? Again, I said stability is really important. What that often means is they will avoid rocking the boat too much. They'll avoid some of those, garden variety complaints, or more importantly, they'll avoid some of those important, bigger things that they're worried about. And not even just things like complaints or some an issue to take up. Sometimes it's things like dreams or fantasies. In the
Mm.
sexual domain, it's often fantasies that somebody is afraid to tell their partner because they're worried their partner is gonna think, "Oh my god, who am I with?" And so to have the ability to tolerate that anxiety and risk it is crucial for intimacy. And I'll finish my little lecture, and this is how I always finish my little lecture with couples too, with my favorite metaphor about stability and intimacy, which is if you think about a plant, a living organism, and a seed falls into soil and it germinates and sprouts and starts to grow, and then somebody comes along and paves a sidewalk over it because that's going to make the walking more stable. That's for stability of people anyway. What's that plant going to do? Well, the plant has roots for stability, but intimacy is the energy for growth. That's how that plant wants to interact with its environment. It wants to grow. And couples are living beings as well as our individuals, and we all want that. And if that gets attenuated, what will that plant do? It will try its damnedest to crack the sidewalk, or it will die trying. And we've all seen, plants growing through sidewalks, it's going to try really hard. Now, when a couple is cracking, metaphorically, cracking the sidewalk, what does that look like? Sometimes, not always, but sometimes it looks like an affair.
Hmm.
There are other reasons for affairs, but that's among folks who contact me, that's the biggie. Something wasn't working in their intimate life. I don't just mean their sex life. I mean, more generally, they felt not alive in their relationship, so they were vulnerable to getting that feeling somewhere else. Or it might look like arguing about everything and nothing, no matter what comes up. Everything turns into a fight, and they'll say, "We argue about trivia, and we don't even know why." That's often an indication of attenuated intimacy. Or sometimes it's somebody just blindsiding the other person and saying, "I'm out of here." And the other person saying, "I didn't even know you were unhappy."
Mm.
So those are often the quote unquote symptoms of lack of intimacy.
I'm wondering, is it is it almost better to think of intimacy and being vulnerable and showing intimacy as a means for long-term stability? Because like, yes, you have this moment of anxiety, but if it's like, hey, this thing's bothering me, and then you address it, it keeps your stability stronger, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. In fact, I often point that out, that lack of intimacy becomes destabilizing. So
Right. Yeah.
absolutely. So that's a great way of thinking about it. It's like, yeah, I feel nervous bringing this up, but if I make a habit of not bringing things up, that's going to threaten stability.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, the resentment is just gonna seep in.
Hmm. Yeah.
Mm,
Yeah. And none of
okay.
this, I just love pointing this out. None of this involves any pathology. Do you know what I
Mhm.
mean? None of this is about somebody having some sort of, psychiatric diagnosis. I'm not saying people don't have those legitimately. I'm just saying this happens to normal couples.
Yeah.
So that,
Yeah.
getting way back around to the first question you were asking about, how does that happen? This passion paradox, and the paradox is simply that stability and intimacy are somewhat in conflict. How does that happen? Well, that's what we were just talking about. And it
Mhm.
happens to normal couples. It doesn't happen to every couple, but it happens to a lot.
Do you view the decline in passion as like a relationship failure, or is this something that just developmentally typically happens to a lot of people? I know we talked about kids earlier and kind of that focus on structure. Like, is it almost like, not for everyone, but for some people, just this natural point that you get to and then you have to address because life needs to be so stable for,
Yeah.
kids and things like that? Or how do you view that?
Says the mother of an 18-month-old child, which is that's right when it's happening. I don't know. Again, I don't know about what's going on in your relationship, but right, that is often when I'm hearing about it. When you start
Mhm.
to have kids and the kids, like I need to tell you, kids take a lot of attention and energy, don't they? Gee whiz,
Yeah.
and you're probably one of those strange parents that actually cares about your children also. You see, if you didn't care, it'd be a lot easier. But there you go, caring about your children. So, right, that puts a premium
Yeah.
on that, and so absolutely, to think of it as a developmental phase is a great way of thinking about it, for a couple of reasons, one being simply that it gives you a little bit of hope, because it's
Yeah.
not like some people think of it as, well, that's just what marriage is, or that's just what relationships are.
Mm.
You have the honeymoon phase, then it's over, don't expect it to be, don't expect to be passionate anymore. What a bummer.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be that way. Now, I don't want to I don't want to say that's true for everybody. I don't know. But if you are fortunate enough to have the right person who you can work on this stuff with, if the stars align, some of it is the stars aligning right. Some of it, well, I will tell you, this sounds like a digression, but isn't. The podcast my wife and I do is called Couples Therapy in 7 Words.
Mm.
Why did we call it that? Well, I have the 7 word formula that we could talk about or not, but it's be kind, don't panic, and have faith. That's the 7 words. Be kind, don't panic, and have faith. Well, my wife will joke sometimes to say, no, really, we could reduce it to 4 words. Find the right person. And she's right. It's like, yes, of course, it's going to depend a lot on some essentials of compatibility. That is
Yes.
certainly true. If you got that, then the phenomenon still happens. That
Right.
often happens, that it's like, oh, after a while, it's like, who are you again? You know, you're wondering, who is this person that you used to feel so passionate about and where did that go? But that can come back if you can address it. And
Hmm.
it also is part of a stage of life thing. You are you familiar with the the U-shaped curve of happiness? Have you ever?
Yes,
Yes.
yes. But
Well,
I'll let you explain it for people who have not seen the graph or
yeah,
uh
it's kind of pitiful, isn't it? I mean, it's
yeah.
because there you well, yes, I will explain it. Yeah, I mean, and of course, obviously, it's hugely oversimplified, I'm sure. But if you plot in lots of different research studies of different kinds, if you plot over a lifespan, what does happiness look like? You know, kids, if they're not in horrible situations, generally are pretty happy, and teenagers even though although your generation and slightly younger are really wrestling with that. That's I'm not
Yeah.
so sure, but anyway, pretty happy. And then you do these strange things like actually find a partner and then, oh my God, have kids. And then it goes down and it
Yeah.
stays down for a while. And eventually, God willing, the kids, get their act together and in our culture leave the nest or at least become
Mm,
adults. And if they are functioning well, then it goes up again because you're not, saddled with all that responsibility. So yeah,
mhm.
that's kind of part of the deal. It's like, yeah, you're not going to have the time and focus on just yourself or just you and your partner that you had before you had a child. That's going to be true for a while. The old guy over here, me, I can sit here and say, "Oh my God, 18 years, nothing." But
Yeah.
from where you sit, I don't think it feels like nothing.
No, it is going by fast, I will say, like, even just parenthood and stuff, like, I blink and he's gonna be
Mm,
2 this summer, which is already crazy to me.
it is
Um,
astonishing. Yeah.
but yeah, I love that quote, it's like, "The days are long, but the years are short." And that's
Yes,
exactly what parenthood feels like the day
absolutely.
woo! And then
Yep.
you look back, you're like, "Oh my god, he's already out of 3 sizes of clothes, and I am not not ready."
Yeah, it is really astonishing how that happens.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess for folks listening, we've talked a little bit about this paradox. We've talked about what stability and intimacy look like. What would be some indicators that you might be getting towards this spiral or in this situation?
Yeah, it's usually not real subtle. At least by the time people are, consulting me, it's not at all subtle.
Mm.
They're feeling bad, they're hurting. They're missing something. They it may not, often folks don't have good language for it. They'll often come in and say, we need to communicate better. And as was one of my my snarkily titled book, which was "It's Not About Communication," which is
Mm.
it's kind of snarky because, of course, I understand what people mean by that. They're having a hard time feeling good when they communicate with each other, but the vast majority of the time they're communicating very effectively. The problem is what they are communicating, which is misery or distrust or that
Mm.
that creeping feeling that says, "Am I in the right life? Am I with the right person? What do I really want here?" That is often what is going on as this is developing. And, I am not so doctrinaire as to propose everybody's fine in a couple. I don't think everybody is fine in a couple. And a lot of people end up being in couples and realize that part of their basic problem is they don't really want to be coupled. And it's interesting that your generation again has a lot more explicit language about that than mine
Yeah.
did. And
Well,
the notion of exploring other models like polyamory or all sorts of
mhm.
other possibilities. But
Yeah, what I'm seeing online a lot too is at least with the women I follow a lot more women than men on social media, to be fair, because I am a woman. But there's a lot of discourse, even just in talking about dating, where women are very, like steadfast in like, I want a partner who's going to add to my life. And if you are going to subtract, if you are going to make me kind of carry all of the mental load or take on much more than what I would view as fair or 50-50 or equitable in a relationship, then I'm not doing it. And like they're going to hold out or they're going to wait or they're just going to kind of step back from marriage and things like that unless they have a partner that they feel is, adequately prepared to give and be as emotionally in depth as they are and things like that, which I respect. I think it's a really good idea in terms of setting yourself up for success, but I would love your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting that your generation, much more than mine, has grown up with feminism
Hmm.
in ways that has opened up, like, as if I need to mansplain to you about that, right? Has opened up doors that were, I'm remembering, in the 1950s when I was in kindergarten, I still remember being asked, somebody would say, "Oh, boys and girls, what do you want to be when you grow up?" And to a person, there were only three possibilities for the girls. Do you know what they are? Can you guess?
Let me see. Teacher, nurse, homemaker.
Yeah, exactly. Bingo. Yeah, you got
Yeah,
them. Yeah,
sounds
teacher,
right.
nurse, and mommy. They would often say rather than homemaker.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
wouldn't even say homemaker. They would often say mommy. So mommy, teacher, or nurse. Because to be a mommy implied you weren't doing anything else.
Hmm.
Obviously, there were loads of exceptions to this. There were single mothers even in the 1950s. Who knew? Of course there were. But those kinds of stereotypes, it never occurred to any of those girls in the class to say, I want to be a doctor.
Mm.
There was a joke even in the 1970s. I remember that. I think they used this joke on All in the Family, or this brain teaser on All in the Family about
Yeah.
do you know the one? Well, I haven't said it
No,
yet, have
no,
I?
no, go
The
ahead.
it's a surgeon is emergency cases come to surgery and sees that it's this man and his son, and they're in critical need. And the surgeon looks at them and says, I can't operate on this boy. This is my son. And everybody's mystified. How can that be?
Yeah.
That's his father.
Yeah, the
Nowadays, it's
doctor
like,
is
well,
a
yeah, it's his
woman.
mother, stupid. That was
Yeah.
hard and I remember that. I remember having to think about that. And
Mhm.
that was in the early 1970s. They used that on the TV show All in the Family. I don't know if you're familiar with the show, but it was a
Yeah.
classic back then. And because that nobody would have thought of it. And I don't ever remember seeing, women as surgeons. My God, it was rare enough that women were MDs at all.
Mm.
And if they were women doctors. They weren't doctors, they were women doctors, or they were women lawyers, because it was so unusual.
Wow.
All of that obviously has changed, of course, and not that you need my approval of it, but I approve. It's like, yeah,
Yeah.
as a man
Thank
growing up
God.
in that era, it's like, good. I'm glad. I am glad. I'm glad the women of my generation have had way more possibilities and have taken advantage of them. That said, it's fascinating because here's stuff I've heard in 30 years of couples therapy, and it's interesting because I've heard it more and more over the years, not less and less.
Mm.
It's from women. And I'm not talking about sort of what's tread wife. That's the new
Oh,
thing.
yes.
Oh
Yes.
my God, that's just such a bizarre. Not possible.
Yeah, that,
Whatever.
we
I'm
don't
not
need to go
talking about
there.
that. I'm talking about women who've sort of grown up with that sort of feminist ideal. Just in the I'm not trying to over define feminism. Just in that simple sense of yeah, anybody ought to be able to do what they want to do and are good at, and these doors shouldn't be closed on the basis of which gender you happen to be. All those same women will often say things like, I want a guy, I didn't realize this, but I am really pissed off that I am earning a lot more than my husband, and he's therefore the one staying home with our kid because we can't afford for me to do it because I earn three times what he does. Why does
Mm.
she earn three times what he does? Because there's lots of couples where that's the case, for various reasons. One of the reasons, and here is a utterly unproven, but I think interesting, possibly interesting theory. So try it on for size. And again, I can compare my own experience, growing up. Now I was a teenager in the 1960s. When I was in high school, if a guy wanted to be, wanted to impress a girl, do you know what I mean? Just that concept. It's like, I want her to think of me as maybe somebody she'd like to be partnered with, he had to show, God, this is such an old fashioned term. This would have been old fashioned in the 1960s. He had to show prospects. Do you know what that means?
Ah,
Is that a
like
term
like
anybody ever
job
uses anymore?
opportunities or
It's just means prospects means he had to show. The assumption was at that time still, of course, the man will be the main earner, will be supporting the family as the woman has children, which of course will tie her down for a while.
Mhm.
That's true. Even as jobs were opening up to women, there was no expectation that women wouldn't be somewhat tied down by having children, and no
Mhm.
expectation that men would be the one taking care of them either, by the way. right?
Right.
That has evolved as well in ways I think are good too, but that nevertheless, that phenomenon to impress a girl, as a boy, to impress a girl, you had to be somebody she'd look at and, maybe not even consciously, but unconsciously, this guy could support, could support us while I'm having babies. It's something as simple as that. It goes way back in evolution. What happened in the course of the last 50, 60 years is women stopped looking for that. And so what effect has that had? On the one hand, you get these amazing, look at the statistics now in your generation on who's earning more money if they're educated. Women are getting better educated. Women are earning way more money. And here's a broad overstatement. Men are floundering. Not
Yeah.
all, obviously, but many men. And partly it's that they don't know what they're good for because women don't need them. And
Mm,
as men, we want to be needed. So that's a tricky part of that. What you were describing, the women you see saying, I want somebody who's going to carry the half the load. Of course you do. But what I'm not hearing from women is I want somebody who can protect me and support me, which is what evolution has has made us want to do. And
mhm.
so men are feeling incompetent.
Yeah.
And there's a bunch of incompetent feeling men that are, first of all, they tend to be assholes. I mean, I don't know what your language,
That's
what your
fine.
language code is. Okay. They will often turn into assholes because, as much as anything else, because they feel incompetent, not because they feel, hyper competent. And they also are more or less useless when it comes to actually doing things like, supporting a family.
Mhm.
I'm
Yeah, I
curious,
think
would
that's
any of that make any sense to you?
yeah, absolutely. I think, like, the next wave of kind of men's work, in my opinion, as a woman, so just my opinion, but I think it has a lot to do with, women are kind of living in both worlds of, like, the professional world and the caretaking world once they have children, and it's like men need to do the same, and I feel like they've lived in that professional world for so long, and they are stepping into more of the caretaking world at home, like, millennial dads are spending way more time with their children, things like that, which is great, and there's still a long way to go,
Hmm.
and if you look at the data in terms of, like, how much time millennial women versus millennial men are spending with their children, like, there's still a big gap, and there's still a lot of women carrying much more of the load, and so I think it's gonna be focused on how are you with your emotional regulation and your communication skills and your ability to anticipate and notice and do and see all the things that need to be done at home and with the family and how to make your partner feel loved and special and same goes for women, but that's kind of what I see. I don't one thing women say all the time and I think it's funny. It's like men want to protect and it's like protect us from who?
Mm.
Other men.
Yes.
Like we don't
Yes.
we
Often
don't
other
need
men. Yeah.
yeah, like, you know, I don't think women are looking for necessarily this, like, jacked, buff guy with a gun, like, we don't really want that, we want you to be able to tell us what's going on in your inner world and, pick up the kids
Yeah.
and know
Well,
how to
that
schedule
is
a
what
doctor's appointment.
a lot of folks will say that, but a lot of those same that's what I found fascinating. A lot of those same women who thought they would say that, and they will also say, actually, some of those same women will be having affairs with the gas station attendant who treats them like shit. But
Mm, interesting.
they'll be hungry for that kind of intensity
Yeah, I
because
I don't think
yeah.
I don't think it's completely unimportant to be, like, attracted to someone and, like, their masculinity and things like that, but I'd say if if your whole focus was, "I'm gonna earn income for our family," and then the woman is also doing that and maybe even earning more than you, it's like, "Okay, what else?" kinda thing.
Yeah, of course. Oh,
Yeah.
and guys, it's interesting you mentioned millennial men are spending way more time with their children than I'm a boomer. We go way back that we used to. Millennial men are spending more time with their children than women did in the 1950s.
I saw that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that's a fascinating phenomenon because it's not necessarily doing the kids any good, and I'm not talking about the men, it's the women too. The idea that there is so much focus on making sure that every moment of kids' lives is regulated and provided for isn't necessarily doing the kids any good. So
Yeah, I
it,
don't know if you've
yeah,
seen like Jonathan Haidt's
I
work on
absolutely have.
on the risk-taking behavior and things like that, and giving your
Yeah,
kids a bit of independence. And yeah, part of me wishes I was like a latchkey kid and I was born a little bit earlier just so that you had a little bit more of that. But yeah, the helicopter parenting,
yeah.
pros and
Helicopter and
cons.
snowplow. The other one is the snowplow parenting. You familiar with
What's a
that
snowplow
concept?
parent? I've
So
never heard
helicopter
that.
parenting, they're hovering over them, right?
Yeah.
Snowplow parenting, they're removing every obstacle.
Oh, that
And
makes
that's,
sense.
you could say, almost worse. And so
Yes.
those are the kids who end up, and Jonathan Haidt, of course, also ties a lot of this to what happened when smartphones and social media came in.
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
those are the kids who show up in college, and he wrote about that along with Greg Lukianis in their book. They show up in college and they have no clue how to do something like pick courses without consulting their parents.
Mhm.
You know, old
Mhm.
fogey talk over here, but when I went to college, I would talk to my parents every 2 weeks on a Sunday when the when the rates were low because it was expensive to make a long distance call. So I would only talk to them every 2 weeks, and there's no way they were going to tell me which courses I was going to
Yeah.
do. It just
Yeah,
was
that's
very different
interesting.
expectations. Yeah.
Dr. Becky, I don't know if you listen to her stuff.
No.
She wrote Good Inside. She's great parenting kind of psychologist, but also very on social media and has a lot of presence publicly. But she talks about that. I've never heard the snowplow term, but talks just about how parents are kind of eliminating frustration from their kids' lives, and the parents themselves don't know how to sit with frustration, but they also are now priming kids to also not be able to withstand frustration because both of you can't really do it. And with removing those obstacles or kind of making them happy all the time, you
Yeah.
are not
Boredom.
setting them up
Kids don't know how to
to
be
have any
bored.
sort of resilience.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, it is, it's a common phenomenon. It's, it is funny at the age that I am to be having this sort of, oh, kids these days, talk, because every generation does that. I'm sure
Yeah.
my parents did it
Yeah.
about my generation, but it's much more of a crisis of anxiety among kids these days than it
Yeah.
used to be.
Mhm.
We were thought of as rebellious or not, not respectful of the old rules and norms, and the boomer generation, we were gonna tear all that stuff down, which I suppose we went and did, but then we went and did what we did to Gen X and the next generation. It's like,
Yeah, thank you so much, by
yeah,
the way.
exactly. It's like, you know, no matter what you can do. Well, do you know Philip Larkin's poem, This Be the Verse?
No.
I will recite it for you. I hope that doesn't get you into copyright
No, of
difficulties.
course.
And I think I've got it down pretty well. It goes like this. They fuck you up, your mom and dad. They do not mean to, but they do. They give you all the things they had and add some extra just for you. But they were fucked up in their turn by fools in old-style hats and coats who half the time were soppy stern and half at one another's throats. Man hands in humanity to man. It passes like a coastal shelf. Get out as early as you can and don't have any kids yourself. That's Isn't that a great poem? And
That
it's
is.
actually, my ex presented when, yeah, I think we had already split up at that point. It doesn't matter. Anyway, she presented that as a graduation present to one of our kids. It was great. And he's the one of our kids who was especially like the poet of the family. And we just love that. And I love quoting that, not because I'm cynical and I'm glad you're having kids, of course, as a fellow member of the species. And I'm delighted to have kids and grandkids now, but because it's that concept that you do realize no matter what you do, no matter what Dr. Becky tells you, but she's wonderful, and I don't mean this in any cynical way, you're still going to fuck up your kids. And it's
Yeah.
okay because that's part of the deal. You better not be perfect. First of all, you can't be. And if you were, it wouldn't be perfect. It would be awful. Because your kid,
Mhm.
exactly as you're saying, your kid wouldn't learn anything about, guess what? Mom's unfair sometimes. Mom's having an off day. Mom's kind of pissed. I mean, what are you going to do? You're going to
Yeah.
have to learn how to cope.
Yeah. Well, we've kind of digressed from marriage here, but I want to bring it back. And we are talking about anxiety, but I think one thing I wanted to ask you as it relates to this paradox and anxiety is why do you think this courage to be vulnerable and to feel anxiety is so important in relationships? Because I feel like in every other facet of our life, we've learned to reduce anxiety as much as we can. Anxiety is bad. We've got medication for it. Like it's just interesting that there's this area of life where we want to promote a bit of anxiety. I'd
Well,
love
I
if you
don't
could
think
talk.
it's just in that area. I think
No,
it
sure.
extends more broadly that if you live your life, I mean, I can speak certainly about the relationship domain, because if you don't, you will suffer, you'll just shut down intimacy, and that will be deadly. And we
Mm,
don't tolerate it. We're living beings. We just don't tolerate feeling dead for very long. So that, in a weird way, it takes care of itself because it becomes untenable. It becomes unstable.
right.
But outside of that domain, think about careers, think about politics, think about any sort of relationships with other human beings. That involves being willing to be honest sometimes. And I'm not saying being brutal and just, inconsiderate. I mean, no, factoring all of that stuff together. But it involves sometimes taking a stand, taking a risk. And if you don't do it, your life becomes kind of dead. And so
Mm,
I think it applies in all sorts of areas. And so, that where, remember I mentioned that those 7 words, be kind, don't panic, and have faith. The have faith part is what enables the don't panic part. And what I mean by faith is specifically, I don't mean it necessarily religious faith at all, although I've met religious people who show this kind of faith, but I've also met religious people who don't. And I've met non-religious people who do as well as don't. So it's not about religion. It's about a mindset, an attitude toward the world that says, this whole business is somehow right to be what it is. There's something good about that. When I quote Philip Larkin's poem and laugh about it, and then here I'm talking to a parent of a young child, and saying, and I say this to parents all the time, absolutely it's important what kind of a parent you are. Of course it is. It's probably not as important as you think it is. And I don't mean that in a
mm,
bad way. I mean it in a good way. It's like in a broad, very broad range of how you parent your child, as long as you're not horrible, and you're not, you know, and look, I don't mean to gloss over like there is such a thing as horribly abusive parenting, right? Of course it exists, and
yeah.
I've worked with lots of people who had to suffer through that. But as long as you're not way over the line into abuse, what style you are is probably going to be fine or isn't, depending much more on which egg and sperm you manage to get together that month than on what kind of a parent you are. There's nature and there's nurture, and the more I
Mhm.
do this work, the more respect I have for nature. That,
That's
your
interesting.
son's the way he is because you were really, I'll bet he's good, like he's doing
He's
okay?
lovely. He's the
He's
best.
lovely, he's great. You know why? Because yes, you're a wonderful mother, and are you together with his father? Or are you a mother? Or
Yeah,
what
yeah.
yeah, his father, yeah. So you're wonderful people, I'm sure you are. Right? I know you are, and I haven't met your husband or your boyfriend or whatever he is, but I'll bet he's great too. But it's mostly because you were really, and I know you have to get the credit for this, Ellie, because your partner didn't know how to do it, and you can't tell men how to do it. You'd have to kill us. But how you decide which egg to select among a couple million, I think, of those,
Yeah.
and then millions and millions of sperm, you had to pick one. You did a damn good job. And as I'm being silly, right? Most people do. Most people win the genetic lottery in that sense. It's like
Yeah.
most kids are okay. Occasionally they're not, right? Occasionally there's serious things wrong. It's really painful. And that even in the behavioral domain, there's some kids that are just incredibly difficult to parent right from the get-go. It's not
Yeah.
because the parents are doing anything wrong. It's that they are wired pissed off or wired in pain or something. So, most kids, well, kind of says the old statistician here, most of us are in the middle of the distribution, most of us aren't at the extremes. Most kids
Mm.
are pretty much okay. You can affect how they are with your parenting, but relax, and that's my big point. If you're relaxed about it, imperfections and all, that's way better for your kid than if you're obsessive about it.
I feel like that's hard to stomach just as a millennial overachiever.
Yeah. Yes,
All
I
of
bet
us
it
want
is.
to do a perfect job and like read all the books and know all the things and, give just the right amount of risky play, but just the
Mhm.
right amount of, you know, oversight and all the
Uh-huh.
boundary conversations and the safety conversations. Like,
God.
I just feel like millennial mothers are crazy, at least all the ones I know, and myself included, like
Yeah.
just trying to know everything to do it the best.
You know what I note, though? I say this appreciatively as an outsider to millennials, as an older guy. Yeah, millennial moms are nuts the way you described. Sure, I get that. But you're also self-aware. Do you know what I mean? It's like,
Mhm.
well, you know you're nuts. And so that's, three
Yeah.
quarters of the way out of being nuts is to know you're nuts. So that's good. But isn't it interesting? Yeah, even the way you said just the right amount of risky play. It's
Yeah.
like you're controlling that too. It's like,
Yeah.
yeah,
Oh, yeah.
don't let them run into the street for God's sake. But you can control risky play. I mean, you can set up circumstances where you just get the hell out of the way.
Mhm.
That's all it takes to allow for risky plays. Just get out of the way. And that is a hard thing to do because yeah, there are no instructions for getting out of the way other than get the fuck out of the way. That's how you get
Yeah,
out of the way.
that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, and one thing I liked about your book in terms of just that conversation about this moves beyond relationships is you had a lot of applications to this stability versus intimacy paradox in so many different areas of life. Like you even brought it up in terms of finances. And I would just love to maybe have you touch on kind of the financial conversation because I know it is such a point of friction for couples
Hmm.
over time. So could we get into that?
Yeah, sure. And indeed, that's one of the biggies. One of the big topics. Sex, religion, finances. Those are kind of the
Yeah.
big three, I think. And often couples have a much easier time talking about sex than they do about finances. It's fascinating. That wouldn't have been true in my generation, but it is often true in yours. Yeah, the financial thing is it kind of fits the paradigm because it's a lot about anxiety because often finances is about anxiety. It's about stability in the sense that you're worried if you can't pay the bills, if you're worried you're going to lose the roof over your head or can't feed your family or whatever. I mean, that's terrifying stuff. And it's also about how do you live in a way that feels authentically joyful? How can you let yourself enjoy money if you have some or, how do you balance those things? And it's funny, I say balance. Balance has that nasty sense of compromise, and it's not about compromise. It's really about allowing the paradox. You know, I'm I'm a
Mm,
I'm a sucker for a good paradox. That's why I wrote a book called The Passion Paradox. It's like, no, the answer is to embrace the paradox. The answer isn't to solve it or find the right balance. The answer is to say, isn't that interesting? Sometimes this is going to scare me, but sometimes it's going to delight me. And I kind of want both.
mm.
And if I'm too worried about being scared, I'll never be delighted. But if I just let myself be delighted all the time, the whole system's going to fall apart. So I'm just going to have to experience both.
Yeah. That's such a therapist take, the whole like both and
Yes, it is.
language. It's like you can be mad and, you know, excited about this certain thing or whatever
Yeah,
they say,
yeah.
but it's allowing two things to exist at the same time, even if they're opposites or you're feeling that ambivalence about something. But I appreciate that. And so, how does this connect to a couple growing together? Like if you've got this balance or this paradox that you have to move through and there's two people in your relationship, assume heterosexual married couple, say. Um how do you make sure you're growing together and you're nurturing both stability and intimacy and even with the intimacy side, it's like you mentioned kind of like sexual fantasies that you'd want to share or talk about, or say someone's feeling a certain type of way about the finances and they want to have that discussion. And how do you make sure your goals or your growth is kind of trending in the direction where you can both still be together and you're not kind of moving apart from each other?
Yeah. Yeah. Great question. I don't have a simple formula. It's about
Mm,
risking it. It's about,
mm,
it's about you don't know how your partner is going to receive any of those things. And if you don't risk it, you won't find out, but of course you won't solve anything or you won't, you'll be dealing with possibly these seeds of resentment or separation or whatever they are. But if you do risk it, it is a risk for a good reason. It's sort of like, controlling the amount of risky play. It's like, nope, you can't. All you can do is try. And, all you can do is take the risk and even then, I don't claim, oh, the answer is always take the risk. No, sometimes it would be kind of crazy to take the risk. You have to evaluate that. You're kind of stuck with that problem. You're going to feel uncertain sometimes, and that's part of the deal. You just
mm,
don't have certainty. The reason I go back to that concept of faith is underneath that, you can say, well, yeah, of course I'm uncertain, but there's something right about that too. There's something that feels really alive about that very uncertainty.
mhm,
That's really what's central to it. That reminds me actually of it's actually a Talmudic concept. I'm Jewish, and no, I'm not a rabbi, but done my share of studying.
Mhm.
And there's a really central Talmudic concept that an argument for the sake of heaven will endure. In other words, whereas an argument not for the sake of heaven won't. What does that even mean? Sometimes the answer is the argument. The argument's more important than the answer. It's more important to realize, oh my God, we're going to argue about this, not in a nasty, horrible way, but we're going to search this out. And we may
Mhm.
not come up with a definitive answer. We may come up with an answer that says, well, I think this is what we want to go with, but there are those other circumstances that might arise. The whole Talmud is full of that stuff. It's full of arguments, and they always, not always, but almost always record the minority opinion as worthy of respect.
Mhm.
And there's a famous Talmudic story where the two main schools of thought at one time, the school of Hillel and school of Shammai, were having these violent, sometimes literally violent arguments with each other. They were, contending, our way's right, no, our way's right. And finally, a voice descends from the heavens and says, this and this, they're both words of the living God. You're both valid, but the law goes with Hillel. What? If they're both valid, why does the law go with Hillel? Well, because the school of Hillel, when they teach it, they also teach the school of Shammai's opinions, whereas the school of Shammai only teaches their own. So they're not saying there aren't differences. They're not saying they're not important. They're saying, no, the main thing is that you argue about them and learn about them because you're going to develop a deeper truth that way. The reason I like monogamy, and not everybody does, right? Let's face it. But here's an I don't want to call it an argument for monogamy because I'm not trying to convince anybody, but I can
Right. Just
say
pro.
one of the things I love about monogamy that I don't think you can get any other way is that it more or less forces you into those kinds of struggles. And I don't mean nasty struggles.
Yeah.
Here you are with someone that you develop a deep bond with that you would be really hurt at losing, even though life involves death, doesn't it? It's like there's always loss. There's another great paradox. It's like, yep, get
Yeah.
used to that one too. There's something right about that too, even though it's painful, right? But what it means is here you are, and it's not about compromising with someone. You're forced into growth in ways that are
Mhm.
more intense with a partner than any other scenario I can think of. And there's something beautiful about that. There's growth available there and fulfillment available there that I don't know another way to uh, experience.
No, I totally agree. I guess that makes me wonder if someone say they're in this stage of, they've grown apart, they feel like they're not really connected or feeling intimate with their partner, or they're losing that spark. Um, how do you decide when to have faith and when to split or
Yeah,
decide
yeah.
that this isn't for you?
Well, and I wouldn't even call those 2 a dichotomy because sometimes having
Mm,
faith leads you to split, you know?
right.
It's like, well, I think, I'd like to think the main thing I provide people as a couples therapist is faith. And I don't mean faith that, oh, you're going to be fine or your couple's going to survive. I mean a much more general sense of this whole living business is really worth getting into. It's like, yeah, here we are, suffering and all. It's meaningful. It's meaningful to do that. So how do you then decide, okay, do you call it quits or do you not? And actually I have a chapter on that in that book too. And I have a whole series on that in that video course I mentioned as well. It's not so easy, is it? And so I offer a kind of rubric about it, sort of guidelines, but I'm saying it with a little bit of like, yeah, none of this is black and white. Basically, if you divide the issues into two different areas, I call them deal breakers versus growing pains. And
Mm,
I have a clear bias in favor of calling something growing pains unless you're absolutely sure it's a deal breaker. And I'll tell you what I mean by a deal breaker. I don't mean you're having a horrible time, and I don't mean to trivialize that, but, that's bad. You could decide to split up because you're having a horrible time with each other, because you're being just terrible to each other. I get that. But what I mean by a deal breaker is a logical deal breaker. And, I can cite my own life, my own first marriage. When my ex figured out what she figured out, it's like, oh shit, this is not going to work for us to be married, is it? It's just
yeah.
not given what we both wanted. And so we sadly, but it was healing, it was sadly, we said, oh shit, yeah, we're going to split. We'll find a way of doing it as humanely as we can, but that's a painful thing to do when we'd been together a very long. So that's that sense of faith is where I'm using that term. That's a deal breaker. So, when somebody, that's what I mean. When somebody realizes there's something fundamentally incompatible, and it isn't just things like sexual orientation, it's things like, even like what kind of life you want to lead. Someone says, I absolutely can't stand living in the city. And the other person is saying, I can't imagine living anywhere else. You're just
Right.
not right for each other. Bummer, but it happens. Those are deal breakers, and they happen. Or a classic, the classic deal breaker, of course. And it's amazing the number of couples who don't have this conversation until they've been together a long time. Would you like to have children?
Yeah.
Oh, I assumed we were going to have children. Oh, I assumed we weren't. Uh-oh. And I've met couples who've been together for 5 years and that happens. And you think,
Really?
wouldn't they have
I
had
thought
that
that would be
conversation?
like a table stakes
Yeah. Wouldn't
conversation.
you think that's almost a first date conversation? It's like, should I
Yeah.
bother having another date with you if you don't want to have kids or if you do want to have kids? Because I am in the other
Yeah.
camp. But it often
Especially
isn't.
now because it is very common for people to say, "I don't want to have kids." Like, it's a lot more popular to choose a child-free life than it used to be, that it definitely warrants a
Oh,
conversation.
God, yes. And of course, people change their minds about that in either direction.
Yeah.
That happens. So that, those things happen. But that is, and sometimes happened when they already have a child, but do they want another one? And one person is
Mm.
absolutely determined to have another and the other isn't, is absolutely determined not to. And, so the thing about deal breakers is unless somebody changes a deeply held position, which sometimes they do, but unless they genuinely change a deeply held position, it's not going to work. So, if it's a deal breaker, yeah, break the deal. I mean, what else can you do? Everything else is a growing pain. And what do I mean by that? It means that at least in theory, growth could get you through this. So losing, if you're talking about people whose sexual orientations line up and whose general values about, choices about having children and stuff like that line up, then merely as if it was a small thing, merely that they can't stand each other anymore. And I've met folks like that isn't inherently a deal breaker. That's growing pains. Now, again, that doesn't mean they won't decide to split up, but I do have a little bit of advice, such as it is, a little guideline for people dealing with growing pains, and that is simply don't break up too soon. And what does too soon mean? Well, who am I to say? What am I to say? That too soon simply means before you've learned what you need to learn here, before you've really understood this in yourself enough so that you won't just repeat this with someone else.
Mm.
So if you're having trouble, if you had a good relationship and a passionate relationship with someone and a great sex life at one time, and then it's gone away. And of course, don't forget, especially about sex, don't forget about medical issues because they certainly do exist. That's an important part of this. Make sure to cover those bases too.
Mhm.
But assuming there's no medical issues, that's growing pain stuff. And often couples can grow through that and discover each other again. And it's really remarkable when they do. Or they can discover that they have grown in such a way that they don't want to do that, but they want to split up in a way that will work as well as it can for them. And I respect, whatever they decide to do, but it's the important part, I think, is that they not precipitously break up because it's too painful. And I have great sympathy for the pain. I'm not trying to trivialize the pain, but breaking up because it's too painful tends to just leave you not having learned what you need to learn.
Do you feel like, though, it would require willingness from both parties? Like, do you need both people to say, "I'm gonna try and make this better," or "I'm gonna try here"? Because I think if one person isn't, then, like, what are you supposed to do? I almost feel
Oh,
like that
yeah.
would be a deal breaker in itself.
Well, yeah, I get the logic of that question. It's right. Of course, that's often what people figure. It's interesting though, if you just think about it kind of systemically, if anybody changes anything, they've changed the system. So, why is your partner responding to you the way they're responding to you? Why are you responding to them the way you're responding to them? Because it's interactive, it's relational. Either one, it doesn't take both parties to change that system. Just one will do it and you've got a different system.
Yes.
So often people will, that's, one of the reasons I do a video course or write books, somebody will enter into that kind of understanding and it will change how they participate. And that will change the system. So it's not like you're not going to change your partner or partner change you. It's that you're both part of an ongoing system and it evolves. So it
Hmm.
doesn't, if somebody is saying, well, this is a classic talking about why men are reluctant, the classic thing for guys to say to their women partners, well, you're the one who's unhappy. I'm fine. So you go get fixed.
Mm.
That's the classic, unbelievably annoying thing that men will often say. And of course, from the woman's point of view, that's ridiculous. She's often thinking, hey, dude, the problem is you're being an asshole, not me. But, which is also often the case. But that phenomenon of one of them just changing, so she goes and figures things out, and often that will change the system. Now, what often happens if one person goes to individual therapy is they end up splitting up because
Yeah.
it scares the other person. And, if somebody goes to therapy and says, I'm just not going to put up with this anymore, and really doesn't put up with it anymore, and the other person is too scared to do anything about it, they'll often split up because they're too scared to actually enter into it, which I
Yeah.
think is kind of sad.
I guess I'm imagining a situation like we were talking earlier about, let's say, like the mental load, or women like wanting more emotionality from a man or something like that, let's say, in their relationship. And so say you have a woman who wants to fix things, wants to change things, wants, more from her partner, or, more help with the kids or the mental load or something like that. And she's tried to do everything that she could do. She's tried chore lists, she's tried reminders, she's tried yelling, she's tried, silent treatment. She's tried everything and it's not working. Like,
I have
is
that
there a
list
point?
in that chapter, by the way. I have that
Yeah.
very list plus a few other things in there. Yes, and
Yeah,
all the
so
things
it's
she's
like,
tried.
okay, I've tried everything I can do on my end. I simply cannot force someone to do something differently, but I need their behavior to change in order for this relationship to feel equitable and work and for my satisfaction. Is that a point where, you know, there's the system is not being changed enough by you, and you need willingness from your partner to change the system effectively?
Yeah, and one of the chief ways that the system often changes in that very scenario, gendered exactly as you described it, is she then says, "I'm out of here." And that gets his attention big time. And I don't mean that in any cynical way. It's like, "Oh my God, you really mean it." Because often he will be in a very practiced denial that she's just saying that, she doesn't really mean it. And if she actually if she really does mean it, not she's just
Mhm.
threatening it, if she really means it, if she's saying, sorry, this is not working, that often precipitates change. Now, that, of course, makes it awfully difficult for the woman to trust it, doesn't it? It's like she's thinking,
Mhm.
oh, that's what it took.
Yeah.
What I will often, well, I've long since learned I don't want to sell people things. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I don't want to suggest that people should believe me or not believe me. That I don't want to get into struggles with people over meaning. I will often simply note, and for people to consider, that that's often what it takes. And again, for good reason, you know, and look, the gender stuff I just find fascinating, and one can over stereotype or under stereotype, Y there are a lot of women who will basically say what they want. They will never say it this way, but what they seem to want is a girlfriend with a penis, and they're not gonna
Mm.
get that. I mean, the thing is, the people who might be able to think like a girlfriend with a penis would be gay guys, and they're not what you want either. Gay guys are like gay guys can be great friends for heterosexual women because and I know this from some gay friends of mine who've schooled me a lot in that. There's a lot of elements there of femininity mixed in with their masculinity. They're a fascinating kind of mix often, and obviously lots of variation among gay guys. But that's, to get a guy who is going to be able to think like a woman isn't going to happen. He's not going to be the guy most heterosexual women want him to be. It's paradoxical. So he's
Hmm.
probably never going to be as good at some of that stuff about the emotional load. There are good evolutionary reasons why women as a group tend to be better at that than
Yeah.
not. It's not black and white. And many men get better at it and need to. We do need to. but it is not going to be the same kind of balance. To force it into being is often why a lot of relationships end up not working out. There's some fascinating research that was done at the University of Vermont many years ago. I say many, probably 15, 20 years ago. It was by women researchers, which I think is significant because this wasn't like, a bunch of men. This wasn't the male gaze talking here. And they were studying couples who were striving for egalitarian relationships, heterosexual couples striving for egalitarian relationships. And what they found was that these couples that had the very, very role-bound traditional relationships tended not to be terribly happy with each other for a variety of reasons, among which the women tended to be pissed off for a lot of the reasons you're describing or
Mm.
implying anyway. And the men were also pissed off because the women were pissed off, and it just wasn't working well. On the other end of the spectrum were the couples that were just determined to not let gender expectations influence who did what at all. Didn't mean that they would always do the same stuff, but they just were not going to let those things influence them. And they found far less conflict. They were, in general, more relaxed with each other, all sorts of good stuff. Sounds good, right? The one
Mm-hmm.
area where the researchers discovered there was a problem in the egalitarian couples, can you guess what it was?
No.
Sex. They
Ah,
would
yeah.
say their sex lives sucked.
Mm.
And not to say that the really traditional ones, it was any good either, by the way, because the women were so pissed off. So that wasn't so great. But they would, most of them would be saying, yeah, that's just a weak part. There's just not much there. There was an exception in a subset. And the subset were people who would say, and the way they wrote this up, they were saying they would sometimes sort of sheepishly say this to the researchers. Well, actually, our sex life is kind of lively because we do role plays. We play power games.
Mm.
And the role plays always involved an inequality of power. Not always, by the way, with the man being, figuratively or literally on top. Often they made the woman be the more powerful, but they would play these power games, and they had really lively sex lives. But most of the egalitarian couples didn't. So what was the sweet spot? The sweet spot wasn't where they divided things up 50-50, using the usual gender expectations. The sweet spot was 60-40. The
Okay.
sweet spot was because what they found, and this is a
60-40 in terms of in terms of what?
women did 60% of the traditionally feminine chores and 40% of traditionally masculine. Men did 60% of the traditionally
Okay.
masculine chores and 40%. In other words, there was a slight imbalance
Right.
by gender, in the direction of the gender
Yes.
traditional gender roles. And what they said, again, a very oversimplified, I'm sure, way of saying it, but yeah, heterosexual couples, the women wanted the men to seem like men. They didn't want them to be just jerks, but they wanted them to seem like men, and the men wanted the women to seem like women. They wanted the women to sort of lead with the feminine side, and the women wanted the men to sort of lead with the masculine side, without either of that being 100%. So
Right.
that was the sweet spot. And that sort of makes sense because those differences are actually real. And, that's one of the things I've noted in doing this for 30 years. 30 years ago, it might have been anathema among a bunch of couples therapists for anybody to admit that men and women tend to be kind of different in
Hmm.
lots of characteristic ways. Yes, huge amounts of individual variation, but there are some characteristic differences between men and women that turn out to matter a lot in heterosexual couples.
Absolutely.
And
I don't think I'm not arguing with that. I think my point was more like, women are over-indexing, I would say, on caretaking and emotional labor. It's like as your, say a woman is buying all the birthday presents for her husband's parents, like things that their own family should do, that as an example. And it's like they're doing all of the appointments, all of the birthdays, all of the parties.
that is,
I think women are doing 85-90% of at-home
yeah.
work
Why is
plus
that happening?
professional work.
Why do you suppose, take the example of buying the gifts. Why do you suppose that happens?
Because I think it matters. It matters to the woman. I think it should matter to the man, but it
Ah,
might not.
bingo. But exactly. That's
Mhm.
exactly it, right? Because that's why she
Yeah.
does it, and resents it, right? She's thinking,
Mhm.
what kind of a person is this
Yeah.
that doesn't matter to? And worse, the guy is thinking, oh, well, she's on it. And so he benefits from it. So it's
Yes.
not like he's saying, oh, you shouldn't do that. But if it was up to him, he probably wouldn't do it.
Right, but then that would reflect badly on like him and her,
And mostly on her.
mostly on
And I think
her.
that's if you want to talk about what's really unfair, and I have this conversation with couples all the time, that is what's really, I think, speaking as a man, and this, obviously I did not learn this in my own experience. This is, not to mansplain to the woman, as I said before, I learned this from women. Here's another example, is one of my favorites. The example of, you're sitting around one day and the house is kind of a mess because you haven't cleaned
Yeah.
up, and you couldn't possibly relate to that with a year and a half old kid, could you? And all of a sudden, the guy says, "Oh, by the way, my friend's coming over,"
Yep.
and he didn't give a shit if the house is a mess. And she's thinking, "Oh my God," and he's thinking, "What's the matter with you that you care?" And I'll often
Uh-huh.
point out to men, dude, you don't know her experience. It is held against her, not you.
Yep.
And she didn't make that up, and you didn't make that up. And I'm not saying, look, there are couples who would then actively resist that. They would say, well, we are just not going to care. But it doesn't work for most
Hmm.
people. And again, and this, of course, is stuff that y'all women have had to explain to men, not the other way around. We don't know this until we learn it, often painfully from some woman who finally gets through to us, which is really frustrating for women too, Liz, if you didn't know, because we just refuse to see it.
Yeah. But that's what I mean. It's like, okay, we can tell you all these things, and I would push back on this idea that women want like a girlfriend with a penis. It's like, no, I want a competent man. I want
Yes,
a
of
man who's
course you do.
competent and
Yes.
knows what matters and cares about the house and the home and all of the things that matter to us sustaining community and relationships and family
Yeah.
ties. And so I
Well,
just want to
and
push back on that because I don't
absolutely.
think
Well,
I
my
don't think a lot
unfair
of women want that.
no, let me comment, if I may, because my unfair characterization of that, of course, women don't want that, right?
Yeah.
The reason what I say is, well, it ends up sounding like that, especially to men, because let's say, and this is a hypothesis you could well disagree with, but let's say that phenomenon that men don't care as much about if the house being a mess or buying the gifts that women do. Let's say that kind of goes along with a lot of the aspects of masculinity that you would actually like. Now,
Mm.
that's an assertion you could well disagree with. You could say, well, who says it has to? And I think I'm coming from a point of view that would say, no, I think those are highly correlated. That a lot of the stuff that makes us as men feel like we're valid men, and including emotional ability, some emotional IQ there, a lot of that is correlated with being different from women about stuff like that.
Sure. But I think maybe my question is like, how does thoughtfulness make, or lack thereof, I guess, in this circumstance, make you more of a man?
It isn't. You don't have to call it. You're calling it thoughtfulness because that you're saying that's better. And you
No,
could
I'm saying
also.
like it's the thought of, oh, like it's my mom's birthday.
Mhm.
Most people get her presents. I should buy her a present.
Yes,
I
indeed.
maybe let's just use that example.
No, that's probably one of the cleanest ones, right? It's like, yeah, of course. And then there's that phenomenon that if he hesitates, she worries about it before he does. So she gets on the case, and so he's kind of relieved of that responsibility.
Hmm.
To turn that around, she would have to tolerate, and and I'm not saying it's fair, by the way, it's not. She would have to
Mm,
tolerate that the possibility that he will do a half-assed job of it or no job of it at all, and it will reflect on her.
right.
Talk about unfair, it's really unfair until the guy not only understands that, but actually says, "Oh my God, I don't want to put you through that."
Hmm.
That won't change. But I'll tell you what works for super overgeneralization, right? But here it comes. What works for guys, speaking as a guy, it's not so much, oh, you're being thoughtless if you don't do that. What's the matter with you? What kind of a jerk are you? That doesn't work. What works for guys is, oh my God, I didn't realize what I'm putting her through
Right.
by acting, by not doing it. Of course I want to do that. It doesn't
Hmm.
work to have her think of him as you inconsiderate jerk who raised you, which, by the way, is usually thought of negatively of his mother. right? That's just
Mhm.
participating in the same problem, right?
Yep. That's funny. I actually made a TikTok like a few weeks ago because I don't know if you know this singer Sabrina Carpenter.
Yes, of
She's like a
course. Yeah.
famous Gen Z millennial kind of person.
Even I have heard
And
of her, which is same
yeah,
something.
and she has this song called Man Child. And it's all of her complaining about this man child essentially. But one line in it says, "I choose to blame your mom." And I was like, "Why?
Yeah, yeah,
When this is a song about this incompetent man,
yeah.
you're saying, and that's your mom's fault. That's a woman's fault because you are incompetent." It made me so angry just
Yes, but
thinking about that. The woman is always blamed.
of course, because there is still, and I don't know how many generations this would take to change. I don't know if it ever would. There is still an assumption that a lot of that stuff you're going to learn from your mom, not your dad. And I say
Mhm.
this, and I say this with great, actually, love and memory of my late parents. I would have learned that stuff from my mom. What I learned from my dad, which has really helped out my wife, I think, a lot. She's expressed appreciation. Is the bit about, oh my God, I want to take care of her. I don't want her to suffer. And if I sense that something, if I'm getting yelled at, I'm not gonna be thinking about, I'm not gonna be thinking about what's it like for her. If she's calling me an inconsiderate idiot, then I'm not, I tend to be defensive at that point. If what I'm
Mhm.
hearing is, this is causing me pain, you don't, especially if it, oddly enough, especially if it was coming from a place of mutual understanding, it's like, oh shit, I can see why you're not getting this. But let me tell you what it's like for me. I know why you don't understand it because you don't experience it. I know why you don't understand why I get upset when you're all of a sudden a friend's coming over and the place is a mess. Rather than being mad at me, say, look, I understand why you don't get it. But
Mhm.
this is what I'm subject to, and I don't think I'm able to just say it's okay. It's funny. Every once in a while, I'll meet with someone where it's a woman. This is when I did a lot of individual therapy, where it was a woman specifically seeking out a male therapist to get a male point of view. And she will
Mm.
be looking for, oh, I'm remembering some instances of this many years ago. Looking for, how would a guy handle this? Not because she should think she should handle it as a guy, but just to get some insight. And it was often eye opening to women to discover, oh, so for me to handle this that way, I would have to really not care about pissing someone off, which is, most women, it's like, I think I do care about pissing someone off. Look, I'm a guy and I don't want to piss people off either, but some of that thoughtlessness stuff goes hand in hand with some of the strength stuff.
Mm.
It depends on how you characterize it. So it's not that it's not that what you want there is bad. It's not at all bad. It's that you're more likely to get it though if you temper your understanding with not being judgmental about it. You know what I mean? Which is true in
Mhm.
both directions.
Yeah. I saw a woman speaking about the kind of the shadow sides of things that men and women want in each other. And one of the ones for what was it? For men, it was like if you want, say you want a man who, is a provider and, is a great salary, it's like, and it, has a great job, you might also then have to accept that he won't always have time for you. And you
Yes.
might be a little bit lower on the priority list if work is going to come first. And almost like the flip side of that coin of, oh, I've got this great provider and he is not always emotionally available at every chance that I need him because work is so important
Yeah.
because he is that provider.
Yes. And here's, oh boy, you could just see how these things unfold. So
Mm.
what if you get that? What could you do that would maybe enhance a sense of emotional connection? It would be, oddly enough, acting in much more stereotypical feminine ways. It would
Hmm.
be, I mean, this is going to sound so smarmy, but it would be like bringing him his pipe and slippers in the old, in the old style. You know what I'm saying? I'm not saying you'd want that. A lot of women would say, oh my God, I don't want that kind of relationship. I wouldn't want
Yeah.
to be in that kind of relationship either, by the way.
No.
But if you want that sort of
Yin and yang.
complementarity that isn't the
Mm.
same as balance, and certainly not the same as equivalence, those two things do tend to bring each other out, and if you're not panicked about that, then it can go very well. See, I think as I'm talking about this is reminding me of the 60-40 thing.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, so those the 60-40 women and the 60-40 men there's a little of that there. Like he's kind of the, the guy and she's kind of, the wife, yeah,
Mhm, mhm.
without any loss of dignity on either side. And
Right.
maybe at a meta level, and this is what when I was saying, your generation's like, yeah, you have all these weird things from our generation's point of view, but you're self-aware about it. You talk about it, it's at the meta level. You can talk about it. It's sort of like, isn't that interesting? Yeah, I'm kind of playing the wife here, and you're sort of playing the husband, but that's okay. Maybe that's good. Maybe that's kind of sexy.
Mhm.
Maybe not. I don't know, but that's in terms of that research, it was sexy.
Yeah.
They were finding that kind of stimulating. It's like, oh, that's kind of cool.
Well, I'm sure you just are aware of how many different structures work, in marriage and in
God, yes.
relationships just by how many couples you see, and that might work for some people, it might not work for others,
Yeah.
and, like, there's kind of beauty in that there's so many different ways that you can be together, and it work or depending on your values and things like that, which I appreciate. Um, we've talked a lot today, about so many different things, but I did really appreciate in your book, and I mentioned, like, there's talk of this paradox, then there's all these places and applications in life where it exists, but I really like your note on faith and not religious faith, but faith in your partner, in you and them having the best intentions, and just like that goodwill almost that needs to exist in the relationship for you to have the courage to be intimate and to have that bit of anxiety and, have those conversations, I guess. And I just really appreciate that point.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I guess, is there anything you wanted to say on that in terms of
Just,
faith and
what you were just describing, I mentioned, my 7 words, be kind, don't panic, and have faith. And they're laid out in that order because if you have faith, you're less likely to panic. That's the antidote to panic. It's like, I don't, it's this ex- recognition that uncertainty, even when it's painful uncertainty or scary, you're really scary, is part of the deal. And
Mm,
that's what I mean by faith. And when you have that basic sense, it's okay, I don't know how to handle this. I'm going to have to figure it out, aren't I? That's the human condition, but the human condition is good. You know,
mhm,
that's what lets you then be kind. And be kind, I mean that in that very sense you were describing of goodwill, the assumption of goodwill is fundamental to wanting to be in a relationship where, if your partner is sort of, snappy at you or something, where when you have an assumption of goodwill, one of my favorite metaphors there is the emotional bank account. When you have a nice
mm,
balance in the emotional bank account, then if your partner is a little off toward you or a little, says a little nasty to you or something, you chalk it up to, oh my God, you must not be feeling great. What's going on? As opposed to if you're overdrawn. That's the reason I like that metaphor. If you're overdrawn in the emotional bank account, you get hit with overdraft fees. You know, everything becomes more evidence of how horrible your situation is, your relationship is, or your partner is, and you're constantly on the lookout for yet another reason why you're not right for each other, and it keeps getting worse and worse and worse. So when things are good, remember I talked earlier about the ability to be moderately annoyed. That's all about having a nice healthy balance in the emotional bank account, because it just means you're generally going to have goodwill. If your partner's annoying, you can laugh about it. It's like, well, God knows I'm annoying. So, you know,
mhm,
on those incredibly rare occasions when my wife is a little bit annoying, I can laugh about it because she puts up with way more from me than her. Even if it was the same, it's like, it's, what happened, what you get with goodwill, gratitude overrides the annoyance.
mhm,
And I will tell you, it's sort of interesting. I don't recommend having a starter marriage as the key. But I will say that the fact that we are each in a second marriage, we've been married now for 21 years. We have been so appreciative of each other's existence for the fact
mhm.
of having been in a marriage that didn't work out, that it has really, in terms of keeping the spark alive, that's been a big factor.
It's true. Yeah, absolutely. If listeners could take one thing away from you, your message, our conversation today, what would you want it to be?
I think it's that concept of faith. I think that's where it all starts. And, again, not necessarily religious, and certainly not like fundamentalist in the sense of dogmatic. I don't mean that.
Mm,
But just that mindset that says, no, this whole business, even when it's hurting, even when you don't understand it, it's meaningful. And that's a good thing. And so you can work with it rather than having to struggle. You're going to have to struggle. That's part of the deal, but you don't have to struggle against existence. And you're right to be who you are. And so is your partner, by the way, even when they're a royal pain in the ass. We're right to be the people we are. That's another statement of faith, kind of an equivalent statement. That's what I would want people to take.
I love that. All right, where can people find out more about you, get connected, or get a copy of your book?
Best bet is just go to my website, brucechalmer.com. If you spell my name right, you got it. brucechalmer.com, all one word. And that will give you access to that video course I mentioned. Also, my practice, if people are interested in actually doing couples work with me, and outside of the states I'm licensed in, I do coaching stuff. And so I can work with people from anywhere. It's all by telehealth. And also information about my books is there. And I just got to put in a plug for that podcast I do with my wife, Judy Alexander, which is called Couples Therapy in 7 Words. And you can find a link to that on my website as well.
Amazing. And I'll put a link to your Passion Paradox book in the show notes for this episode. But
Thank you.
Dr. Bruce Chalmer, thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thanks. It's been delightful.